I just would like to welcome you all here today to this exciting presentation, another ACEN Will Australia research grant. It's the research conversation. So, and just to really begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, Will Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout our nation and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. All of us have a shared responsibility to work toward justice and equity. My name's Dr. Elizabeth Cook. I'm from Queensland University of Technology and ECU, and I recognise and thank the Noongar Whadjuk people who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work in Perth, Western Australia. And if you'd like to share where you are situated in our country or elsewhere, if we've got anyone from elsewhere outside Australia, please feel free to share your location, the country that the lands on in the chat. So our presenter today is Dr. Matthew White from Australian Catholic University. And I'll let Matthew introduce himself because he's probably best to do that. But I just wanted to mention that as a former secondary school teacher and a neurodivergent individual, I've been really looking forward to his presentation for quite some time, since he actually was successful in winning the grant. And his project was titled Becoming and Flourishing as a Neurodivergent Teacher. So we are delighted to have you here today to present, Matthew. And before I hand over to you, I'll just a little bit of housekeeping. If anybody has connection issues, please try logging out and returning via the same URL you received to join the meeting, or wait for an email with instructions on how to join. And after Matthew's presentation, there will be time for questions, and you can post your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and we'll go through that at the end. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Matthew White for you to share your research findings with us.
Thanks,
you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's really nice to present. It was such a long time since, I guess, since winning the grant and then doing the research, and at the end of last year we published a report which I'll talk about. But maybe to introduce myself first, I'm at Australian Catholic University. I was a secondary school teacher and an inclusive education coordinator in a school, and then maybe an inclusive education system leader. Then I moved over and became a policy analyst, and then worked across systems, school systems, supporting students predominantly who had school attendance problems. And I've only just recently moved across to university where I lecture and research in inclusive education. And this particular project, it came about by accident. I sort of run these very, very big inclusive education units where we have perhaps 1,000 students in the units, and the units themselves prepare teachers to go out and do placement. And in my units, there was a number of students who I sort of flagged while they're in my tutorials. I guess as a teacher, they just sort of stood out, and I sort of went to my manager and said, what's happening, or what are the adjustments, or what supports we're putting in place for our neurodivergent teachers? And my manager sort of came back and said, well, we don't have anything. There's nothing here. And then I sort of got online and tried to look for other things, what other universities were doing, and there didn't seem to be very much, or not many guidelines around there. At the same time, one of my other roles was going out and unfortunately visiting students who are at risk on placement. And quite often there was this correlation between students who are at risk or having difficulties on placement and sort of, I guess, being neurodivergent. And a couple of things I'll talk about it as we go along around sort of disclosure and diagnosis and understanding neurodivergence, but quite often when I was out on these placements, the students themselves, they didn't really have a diagnosis or didn't even understand that perhaps they might be neurodivergent. And that sort of opened up another sort of interest that I sort of sought to investigate. So what happened then was I sought to sort of understand, first of all, what are some of the barriers to I guess, neurodivergent teachers. And it just so happened that at that time, ACEN at the time had a grant open to explore working integrated learning. And I don't know how I got it. I think it came in my email. And so that was sort of the starting point. I put in an application, and I looked around who else was doing research in this space. And there was another researcher down in Melbourne, Dr. He's associate professor now, Matthew Harrison. Um, and there was another researcher down at University of Tasmania who was undertaking her PhD in the experiences of neurodivergent teachers. So I sort of got them together and said, would you like to come on board for this particular project? And we put the grant in, and we were successful. So I guess this presentation will walk you through the research that we did and the project that we undertook. Feel free as I'm going along. I'm a bit guilty of talking a lot, but feel free as we're going along to just pop your questions in the chat. I've got it open. I can jump in and answer them as we're going on. I'm hoping this will be won't be sort of a monologue, but we ought to at least yeah, answer questions as we're going along. There can be a bit of back and forward to make it easier for you. So what I might do is I might just share my presentation screen. Here we go. Now, the other thing I'm guilty of, especially when I'm teaching, is I'll be talking away and there'll be something. I won't have shared my screen properly. I'm just confirming everyone can see my screen and the presentation. Brilliant. All right. Okay, so the the uh, the project that I pitched for and that I was seeking to undertake eventually becoming and flourishing as a neurodivergent teacher, because the whole idea was definitely there was a lot of neurodivergent pre-service teachers who were undertaking training, and there was obviously neurodivergent teachers out there who who are employed and working, but I really wanted to see what were the sort of conditions or what were the things that we needed to ensure that those teachers were actually flourishing and were able to flourish in their profession. And I guess flourishing comes from the positive psychology and well-being sort of paradigm. So the project itself started with I probably again that problem. Well, what's happening for neurodivergent teachers? And first of all, I sort of went straight into thinking, okay, I have to tell my colleagues, or I have to tell my the supervisors who are supervising these teachers on placements about neurodivergent teachers. However, as soon as I sort of started to look at this training and awareness, I realized that we just didn't know very much around prevalence and experience and barriers and current supports that were out there. There just wasn't a uh, wasn't a research base currently, or not a very big one out there. So I decided to engage in, I guess, research to begin with, to look at, okay, what are the barriers, what are the supports for neurodivergent pre-service teachers? And to do that, I sort of had to look at what are the barriers and supports for sort of in-service teachers also. And then the second, I guess, arm of the particular program was to develop some form of guide or training for university staff and professional practice mentors, so that we could increase awareness, but also provide some practical advice for those mentors. The whole idea was to reduce the numbers of students going out on placement and not having a successful placement. And often what I was finding was that these sort of students who were failing placements, a lot of the time was social breakdown more so. And the really sad thing I was finding was almost like, sort of compare it to like blood in the water for sharks on placement, where as soon as there was this any sort of sign that the student wasn't sort of keeping up, or instead of the teachers sort of coming and wrapping around and supporting the student, there was sort of like they sort of piled more pressure on the student until they eventually failed. So a lot of times when I was going out and doing those visits, it was sort of a like fait accompli to fail that student. So really the whole goal of this was to sort of build awareness, put in place some training and supports. And then the last part was this idea of mentoring, the idea that okay, we need sort of pre and during supports. We need to sort of support our neurodivergent teachers before they go on placement and whilst they're on placement to ensure that they have these successful experiences. Um, Early on, and so in terms of the actual uh, going headlong into this, early on there was a few I guess terminology things that I ran up against. I was really lucky. The lady down in Tasmania, Cat Stevens, she had a neurodivergent reference group. And so the whole idea was that, again, myself, I'm not neurodivergent. I really wanted this to be participatory research. A lot of the literature out there was that there's a lot of people doing research about or neurodivergence and neurodivergent people, but they're not including those people in the research, and they're sort of dictating them or telling them what their experience is. So the whole idea was that I wanted this to be sort of participatory driven, and that I wanted to ensure that it was sort of authentic. And so one of the first things I ran up against was this, I guess, issues with terminology. And for me, I considered neurodiversity, and neurodiversity itself really refers to that, I guess, the natural diversity of how people think and the variation of neurocognitive functioning across the entire population. This breaking away from this idea that there is like a norm or like a normal cognitive functioning. Um, and then obviously in the literature, it says it's an umbrella term for brain functioning, differences that diverge from dominant social standards. And again, it's shifting away from this, I guess, this medical model of difference, or this medical model of abnormality, normality, towards sort of social constructs of disability. And if we look at sort of the social conventions in especially schools, where it's a highly social and emotional profession, a lot of the constructs that are barriers that are present there come from these sort of social standards. So neurodiversity tends to be the more broad term, referring to different ways of people thinking about things, and different ways of neurotypicality, and where neurodivergence itself describes individuals whose thinking, learning, perception, or social interaction patterns differ significantly, more significantly, from social norms. And so examples in terms of from medical models includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and Tourette's. And there's they sort of, when they if you sort of do a search, neurodivergence, and you look for images, you tend to get a picture of an umbrella, and under the umbrella, there's a whole range of neurodevelopmental sort of conditions that fit under neurodivergence. It's looking at more of a broader, I guess, picture of neurodiversity, and I sort of chose that because a lot of the young yeah, a lot of the young people who I was coming up against, they didn't have a diagnosis. So it was really difficult in this particular study to sort of say, well, we're just going to get um, autistic teachers or autistic pre-service teachers and focus on them. So we decided to focus on neurodivergent teachers, and irrespective of whether they had a diagnosis or they didn't have a diagnosis. So if I keep going. So the research questions we had then were, what are the barriers to neurodivergent teachers flourishing? What supports neurodivergent teachers and currently access? So we wanted to know like what's currently happening, and then what supports neurodivergent teachers need to thrive. And we're including pre-service and in-service teachers here. And then the idea is that if we had a picture of what current teachers, or what sort of supports current teachers we're using, then we might be able to backward map those supports to our teacher training and the supports that we're putting in place with our supervisors. Um, the theoretical framework that we set ourselves, and it was probably Associate Professor Matthew Harrison down in Melbourne who has done research probably around young children and gaming, and also academics, supports needed for academics who are neurodivergent, is the this idea of this double empathy problem. And I sort of alluded to it previously when I was talking to you about the defining of neurodivergence or neurodiversity. Milton, again, 2012 is his latest paper, but I think it was probably a lot earlier than that, came up with this double empathy problem around this idea that neurodivergence, or the difficulties that a neurodivergent people have, doesn't come so much from this pathology, or it comes more so from this mismatch between understanding. So the understanding that we have in schools, or the understanding that we have in society around what normal new sort of behavior is, or what normal social norms are, or what normal understandings are, and the understandings that neurodivergent people have, and this idea that if we can just come to terms, or align this misunderstanding and arrive at a like a common understanding, that we can remove some of these barriers that are there in terms of neurodivergence. It's a more, in terms of the double empathy problem, it's more around I guess this social model thinking of disability being like a social construct, and it definitely it removes this idea that again, pe or autistic people or neurodivergent people, they're not empathetic, or that they can't that there is this big difference between and so it's really this idea that it's this mismatch between understandings. The other framework that we sort of developed as this research was going on, and this sort of unfolded with it unfolded when we sort of discovered that a lot of the students that were coming across were undiagnosed, and it sort of was surprising for me, because coming from schools, I always had this concept that and neurodivergent students would have had a diagnosis early on, maybe at school, and they would have brought that diagnosis with them to university, and that they would have had some understanding that they were around the sort of differences of what needs they had. But what I was finding was majority of the neurodivergent teachers who were coming for support, who were sort of being flagged for at risk on placement, were just unaware of their diagnosis, or they were getting a diagnosis at the time of doing their placement. And so when I got together the research guiding committee, and there was a number of neurodivergent teachers on the guiding committee, like 4 out of the 8 had a late diagnosis, and like 2 or 3 of them sort of told stories where it wasn't until their first placement that they realized there was something that was wrong. And one of the sort of members said, "Oh, it wasn't until I was in the storeroom crying every single lunchtime that I had this sort of feeling that I wasn't okay. I wasn't okay, and it was only just by luck that I went to my GP, and my GP suggested it, and I was surprised that GP, given the symptoms, suggested it and said, "Hey, have you thought about this?" That I was able to, yeah, was able to sort of get to the bottom of it. And so what we found then was that it wasn't just young people like struggling with this new neurodivergent identity. It was the young people going on placement or doing work integrated learning and struggling with neurodivergent identity, plus also struggling with this new professional identity that you develop whilst you're undergraduating while you're doing work integrated learning, plus also this social identity or this new social identity that the young people that they're developing. So there was all this going on for those young people as they were going into placement. And we thought to investigate that further through this particular research. And I can see there's a few few sort of comments there. And I found that really interesting. I found that the whole idea of later diagnosis. However, just going back to that, what I also found was one of the jobs I used to have. I used to do preschool school transition, and I found that there's a lot of new diagnosis at transition points. So, and usually I did find was when the social emotional demands of environments sort of increased. We got a lot more diagnosis. So all I could sort of hypothesize at this point was that a lot of these young teachers or neurodivergent teachers were highly intelligent. They're able to perform really well at university, like that they were sort of HD and D distinction students. They were able to perform very well in small groups, and they were very high achievers. But when they were when they went out to placed in schools, and the social emotional demands of school was sort of amplified, it meant that their social emotional load sort of tipped, and also they didn't really have the tools at that point to manage that additional load that they were taking on, and it started to create some issues. The other thing that we found challenging was this challenging policy landscape. And so obviously coming from an inclusive education a background, I'd always thought that the DDA and the disability standards were, I'd always sort of fought myself as well to enshrine them to sort of protect the rights of especially young people engaging in education. But I didn't find that when young people progress from education or they progress to higher education, that the same standards were kept, and that even when they progress from higher education to work, that the same standards were sort of enshrined. And so I found, especially going out on placement, that whilst definitely there's protections there that require reasonable workplace adjustments for neurodivergent staff, these are really problematic, and there was differing treatments that that our pre-service teachers got, whether they disclosed or they didn't disclose. And I'll talk about that a bit later when we have a chat about sort of this stigma and disclosure. But for many, it meant that a lot going out on placement, if they did have a diagnosis, they just decided not to disclose, which created a few issues around requesting formal adjustments and limiting access to supports. So what we decided to do initially was undertake a national survey. And so we sent out a national survey through some advocacy groups and online and social media. And I was just blown away by how many neurodivergent teachers, and the survey wasn't open for very long. I think it was open for a couple of months to run this research. And we sort of had, I think we had about 250 responses, but we had 191 complete responses. And it was people from all sectors, so early childhood, primary and secondary, that we collected sort of responses from, and all sort of levels, and also all I guess all years of experience. We had some quite some teachers who had been in the profession for, let's say, 20 years, and had sort of recently come to a diagnosis and come to an understanding of themselves. So it was really interesting to collect that. And what we did find overall was that majority of the teachers and even our pre-service teachers were really satisfied in their current positions as teachers. Like they had a real passion for teaching, and they had a real passion for working with young people and the profession. Most teachers were satisfied with the support their teacher mentor provided them during professional experience. Whilst there were some horror stories, most didn't say, "Hey, I didn't get any support," or it was terrible. Um, Most teachers didn't have a discussion with their teacher mentor regarding adjustments they might require during professional experience. And I'll talk to you a bit about that a bit later. And the big thing that came out in the survey really was that there was a significant lack of communication about adjustments in schools. Like when asked how satisfied you were with the adjustments that schools provided, there was this complete contrast between job satisfaction and satisfaction in the support they got. So it was, yeah, a lot of pretty much if teachers did disclose, they were really dissatisfied with the adjustments that they were providing. And so what we found in the research was that majority of the teachers had a what we sort of called self-adjustments, where they were managing their own adjustments in schools. And so we had a sort of qualitative aspect to this research where the qualitative aspect to this research where we were asking that the teachers to I guess describe the adjustments or outline some adjustments that you were provided with, and often they would say, "I was provided with none, but I organised my own adjustments. I organised for I've found a quiet place in the school. I've sort of turned the lights down low in my classroom. I've put these things, organisation things in place myself." And a lot of teachers were doing that on their own without support from sort of management or schools. And the same as our pre-service teachers, a lot were imposing these self adjustments. So in terms of significance there, it and the other big thing that came out is that imposing these self adjustments or putting these self adjustments in place was quite taxing on a lot of pre-service teachers and teachers, to the point where a lot in the survey said that that they didn't work full time, that they work part time to be able to manage the workloads and the stresses that they sort of undertook. I'm just having a look at the questions here. Yeah, do you know what, the ethics process for this particular study was complex. It we had to have a lot of closed questions, and we had to ensure that teachers weren't, I guess, recounting sort of episodes where they weren't supported. So what we applied, our approach when we were applying our survey was really like an appreciative inquiry approach. And I tend to, when I'm doing this research or this type of research, I always apply this instead of getting respondents to detail, I guess, the things that aren't working. If you notice my research questions, there was structure around looking at, okay, what are the things that are working for you, or what are the supports you're currently receiving, and then what are the supports that you think need to be in place there. And so a lot of the questions, all the responses, the respondents sort of put in the open responses. I'm not receiving anything, and I'm doing all this for myself, as opposed to recounting, recounting negative experiences that might be triggering that we couldn't control over. So this was, again, our survey was really interesting, and so from our survey, what we then did was we undertook, I guess, a mixed method approach, and again, you're looking at like research approaches if you're into that. Originally, we were looking at the qualitative data from an interpreter's viewpoint, but because of the time and because of the amount of data we had, eventually it became sort of a pragmatic approach where we were just looking at the okay, what are the things that support what are the current supports that our pre-service teachers are receiving, and what are the things that are going to help our sort of pre-service teachers and teachers to flourish within their profession. And so we developed a framework, and the framework itself, what we wanted was to form the basis for like a guide or a set of questions that that our pre-service teachers could ask themselves, that schools could ask themselves, that education systems could ask themselves, and also universities could ask themselves around supporting neurodivergent pre-service teachers and in-service teachers. When I sort of pitched the guide to the neurodivergent research group, they were against it. And I couldn't understand why they were against it. And they came back to me. I think what I did was I pitched to them a similar guide, and the similar guide, the title of the similar guide with a UK researcher had developed was the amazing neurodivergent teacher, and instantly they sort of didn't like it and they didn't want a guide at all. And the reason behind that was that by having a guide, it means it outs them as neurodivergent in schools. It separates them from staff, and sort of they said it again, you sort of say othering, made them feel as though either pulling the guide out or using the guide would make them the token neurodivergent person, or would limit or devalue their professionalism as a teacher. They didn't want a guide, and really what they wanted was they wanted these universal supports in schools that irrespective of whether the pre-service teacher was neurodivergent or not, would be supportive. They could plug into. And so, in terms of developing our framework, then we focused on there was a lot of things that our pre-service teachers and teachers were doing themselves, and the idea then was that there's this great potential for capacity building of our pre-service teachers, or our work integrated learning students prior to going on placement around, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Also, there's a heap of things that our pre-service teachers and teachers detailed to us that were supportive in schools, and so whilst I sort of think it's doom and gloom, and that pre-service teachers were deeply unhappy with the supports they were receiving, there were a lot of schools who were doing really good things, and there were a lot of managers and principals and pre-service teacher supervisors who are really caring and understanding, and were able to support those pre-service teachers during their professional experience, and get them through. So the other big area we looked at was that university supports, and then education system supports. In the middle, or squeezed in between the supports, were these sort of tensions that we identified, and there were sort of unavoidable sort of things. And the first one sort of speaks to the actual having a guide, or having something that outs neurodivergent teachers in schools, with this community misunderstandings of what it meant to be neurodivergent. And so a lot of the neurodivergent teachers, I know I interviewed as part of another project, interviewed a young neurodivergent teacher who is starting a rural remote placement, and he just said, I can't. There's no way I'm going to disclose I'm neurodivergent. There's no way that the school or the community would understand that, and so there's still work, I think, around this community understanding of neurodivergence beyond our media stereotypes of what it means to be neurodivergent. There's huge tension in the responses around whether they're going to disclose or they're not going to disclose. And I think that's a real big one. Also, there's huge tensions or challenges around processes for disclosing disability, and current systems in place follow a medical model. And I've had cases, not connected to this research, but just through my supervision of students, where as soon as students disclose, it triggers a process, and students have to then go and undertake a medical assessment. And if they don't undertake a medical assessment, then their place is in jeopardy. Um, and then a lot of pressure is placed on them to demonstrate what adjustments that they require. And then instantly it triggers questions about inherent requirements and whether that young person is going to be able to meet the inherent requirements of being of performing and being a teacher. So there's a big issue there. Um, and this is closely connected to the other that other tension around this negotiating of workplace needs in sort of conflict sometimes with the inherent requirements of being a teacher. And so some of the things that teachers came or our pre-service teachers came up with that presented challenges for them were like yard duty, and noisy classrooms and organization. And there are a lot of fantastic schools who are really understanding and who timetabled our neurodivergent teachers in quieter spaces such as the library, or didn't put them out, or didn't put them inside, let's say like a noisy sports hall or something like that, and we're mindful of that. The same with organization. There were a lot of great schools. Neurodivergent teachers came forward and said a lot of great schools who were able to forewarn them about events that were going to take place, give them a lot of help for organization and executive function sort of things. But there are inherent requirements of being a teacher, and I spoke to another teacher who was a food tech teacher who had quite high sensitivity to particular smells. And these smells were in her food tech lab, and it sort of got to the point where she couldn't be in the food tech lab, and the inherent requirement of her job was to be in the food tech lab or the kitchen they had. The school were fantastic in terms of they found another place for her, but there is that tension there. Um, and also establishing a relationship with school prior to the beginning of placement. I'm not sure if anyone else is working in the professional experience space, but the professional experience process of locating, sourcing, and then placing students is messy. Often students, at best, they get probably 2 weeks prior to their placement starting, indicating where they're going to go. And then from that 2 week point, there's this mad rush to find out, like, where is the school? How do I get to the school? What are all the things I need to know before I get to the school? So the and it's expected quite often for a lot of young people who are going on placement that they just roll up on day one, and we're going to tell you everything that you're going to need to know on day one, and you'll be okay. The other thing was this range and heterogeneity of needs, sometimes conflicting with each other. So there's no one size fits all solution. What we found was that it's the same with having a guide. It's just impossible to have a guide that we can give to schools and say, hey, if you've got neurodivergent teachers, or if you have neurodivergent pre-service teachers, here's the guide. These are the supports that you need to put in place. The variance of what pre-service teachers needs means that it was just impossible. And also the last one, speaking to the fact that they definitely want those adjustments and want that support, but they don't want to be known as the neurodivergent teacher, or we don't want to know as different, especially if they're starting new and they're trying to establish their identity in that school. They don't want to be sort of questioned around their professional competence or their ability to undertake the role. So we put together a guide. And this is the guide. You can download the research report and the guide. It's on the Work Integrated Learning website. And the I don't know what to read first. Maybe read the research report first, and then have a look at the guide. But the guide itself, what we hope to get would come from the guide would be some advice for, again, our neurodivergent teachers, our schools, our education departments, our universities, to help them to support these neurodivergent teachers, but also to a lot of the things that were raised were things that, again, myself coming from being a teacher, were things that would support beginning teachers and pre-service teachers universally anyway, such as a quiet place, uh, checking in with the teacher, ensuring that they have all the information that they need. before starting a placement. So we developed a guide, and then within that guide, we pulled out these recommendations. And so we split the recommendations through across those headings I just sort of mentioned before, looking at building capacity of neurodivergent teachers to have sustainable careers. We position that within the guide with this understanding that yes, definitely we need to build capacity of neurodivergent teachers, but it's a partnership. It's not saying to our neurodivergent teachers that, hey, you need to be more resilient, or you need to build your own capacity, or you're failing because you haven't developed enough capacity to sort of to get on here. But it's this understanding that if the more aware our sort of neurodivergent staff are of their needs, the more they can communicate those needs or manage those needs in the environment. One of the big things that we found was that, and this is universal across beginning and pre-service teachers, this managing fatigue levels, and setting themselves up before they get to placement. So ensuring that they've got a lot of the supports that were in place were things around, I have mum and dad to help me cook food and to help look after me, or I have my partner that's really supportive that I can come home to. Not having long trips to placement, so ensuring that they have they're aware of how long it's going to take to get to placement. I guess financial security whilst on placement. As I sort of said, support systems, like family and meals and social social supports, psychological support. There was one fantastic school that for their beginning teacher who sort of disclosed that she was neurodivergent, they arranged an OT assessment and support, and they provided a map of the things that she might need to sort of do well and within her position. And then the other part, I guess, for our pre-service teachers and beginning teachers is that confidence, understanding how do you ask for help, and then that probably plugs into our next steps, which I'll talk about later, which is our mentoring. And there's a couple of, I'm sure people can see a couple of quotes there that we pulled from the open-ended. The other one was capacity of schools. So I think a lot of this rests on your teacher mentors and also schools and principals, understanding, plus also being flexible. So a lot of the pre-service teachers and teachers in their responses, their key to success, a lot of them said, there was just this one teacher at school who really cared. She or he took me under their wing, and I was able to talk to them. And if I had a problem, I could go to that particular person. They helped me a lot. In terms of supervising teachers, there were teachers who came and said that my supervising teacher was fantastic because they let me be myself on placement. They didn't expect me to follow their style of teaching. They let me make mistakes. They debriefed with me, and they gave me support along the way. And the staff, like the broader staff. So there's one there, friendly and warm staff. There was like 10 staff at the school. They had a morning tea together. I felt included. And this whole idea of social inclusion in schools was really big. And so the big one there is this empathetic and neurodiverse literate school leadership. I think that was a really big one. Just leadership in schools, being aware of the needs of neurodivergent staff and being empathetic. But coming from schools again, myself, I think having empathetic staff across the board universally to the needs of staff and understanding work levels, understanding stresses and fatigue and things like that, and been listening to staff not only helps, I guess, our neurodivergent teachers and pre-service teachers and supervisors, but it helps set that culture across a school. A big area for working in real learning was our a capacity of pre-service teacher mentors. At the moment, and I'm speaking a little bit from experience here, it's sort of luck of the draw. who you get. There is a lot of there is training out there. So at Australian Catholic University, we run some training for within our school hubs and our mentors within our school hub, Department of Education New South Wales, and our independent schools come in and they receive training. There's some ACEN training around sort of being a teacher mentor, but in the mentor packages, there's no training around being neurodivergent aware or understanding of neurodivergent needs. So it's difficult, and then a lot of our pre-service teachers are really relying on the empathy of that pre-service teacher mentor to be able to guide. Do you want to jump in, Elizabeth, and give me a break for a second? You got a
Yeah, I
question?
just want to say that we're nearly at time. So
Okay, all right. So I'll just
there's 10 minutes left around
yes.
about. So well, no, but yeah, well, nearly 10 minutes. So a little bit more than 10 minutes. So I just
Okay,
wanted to let you know that so that
great, excellent.
we've got a few questions. Yep.
All right. So what I might do is I might just I'm really guilty of this. I think I've sort of gone through the main areas that we looked at, but we looked at build capacity of school systems, building capacity of universities. As I said, the organization of placing students, and then our next steps. I think this ongoing dialogue around how do we build these universal systems of support, how do university provide greater training for staff, how do pre-service teacher mentors receive that targeted training they need, and then how do school systems implement policies that allow neurodivergent teachers to thrive. And my next step, and I've already started, I think I started 2023, is like a mentoring program for our pre-service teachers. So questions, anyone want to jump in and ask any
I know.
questions?